This webinar is on Plan, Do, Study, Act cycles, the fourth component within the model for improvement, and how we can take our aim, measures, and intended changes to determine what works best for carrying out test of change within your clinical setting. The cone of learning looks at what we tend to remember after a 2-week time period has elapsed. The more active we become in the learning, the more likely it is that we'll remember the items that we're working on. While listening to, reading, hearing, and seeing this webinar, you are passively learning as you take the concepts from this webinar and translate them into doing the real thing in a form of active learning. 90% of what you learned will be remembered. Now it's time to be active in our learning by either simulating the experience or doing the real thing. That's where the PDSA cycle comes into play, with 4 simple steps: plan, do, study, and act. You may have seen this before as the Schuhart cycle, the Deming cycle, and most appropriately, the learning and improvement cycle. And we'll go through the learning and improvement process over the next couple of slides and in your improvement efforts as you trial things using the PDSA cycle. Just a few quick things about the PDSA cycle. It's really our framework for learning on a small scale in all of our various environments. It helps us to answer questions related to your team, or the collaborative aims. And it's really to test and see how we can adapt a change idea based on our current working knowledge and our current level of confidence before we move to implement any of our plans or spread any of our changes to the rest of the system. That does not mean, though, that we can't use the PDSA cycle to figure out the best way to spread and implement our ideas once we have good working knowledge and high level of confidence about what works best. So looking at the Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, it's really for testing, trying to figure out what works on a small scale within your specific environment. And as you do this over a variety of conditions, conducting more and more tests, we become more confident in our ability that this is the appropriate change for the environment that you're working in. We can then move to implementation after we've conducted many tests of change to begin to integrate this change into our day-to-day operations. And even as you're implementing things, you can still be doing PDSA cycles for how to best spread this effort that you know works. As I just mentioned, the PDSA cycle is for testing changes on a variety of conditions and in different settings before we move to implementing. And that's a wide spectrum from testing to implementation that can be looked at through the lens of evaluation, one of the 10 key components for sustainability. We can move from the items that we put in, our inputs and activities, to what we hope to accomplish in the long term. The key to success is to have this evaluation plan from the beginning as you're laying out your multiple iterations of the PDSA cycle to test best ideas and to figure out how to implement those best ideas and to use this evaluation plan throughout your improvement process. We need to really figure out which methods and innovations work to improve the quality of care that you're delivering, and to construct a plan that provides you with evidence of the changes that have been made, when they've been made, and how they were made, as well as the impact they've had. It helps you to monitor the achievement of the objectives that you've set out to accomplish, again, looking back at your individual, practice, or collaborative aims, to figure out why those specific innovations were successful, and then if you had to choose some critical factors for success, to identify which are those key components. So as you embark on this improvement process and begin to test your changes, take a step back, lay out this evaluation plan so that you can be successful from the start, stepping out on the right foot with sustainability in mind. You want to think in the short term of what you'd like to achieve for your initial test of change, and your PDSA cycles, and how will those initial cycles lend to what you hope to learn and see in the immediate future, the intermediate future or medium-term outcomes, and ultimately by the end of this collaborative and as you move forward, so that you can figure out how to best scale up your testing and implementation efforts. So when you start with your initial test of change in your PDSA cycles, think about how your inputs and activities will help you reach the first short-term outcome or output that you would like to accomplish. Who is that specific audience that you're targeting and the potential spread through your reach efforts? And then what you would like to have happen in the short, medium, and long term. After you've laid out a very structured evaluation plan, you can really break it down into two pieces, your starting point and your end point. Looking at your ideas, potentially from the key driver diagrams, right-hand side with your potential interventions, things that have been found to be best practice, part of your evidence base, your own personal experience, and ideas that you're coming up through innovation, to how you can get towards that left side of the key driver diagram and your ultimate goal or the long-term things that you would like to accomplish. Most likely your main reason for participating in this collaborative or main thing that you would like to work on and improve. And then look at those two things. What's that gap between your ideas and the best practice evidence base to the goal that you'd like to move towards? And what needs to be done to make progress between those two? Thinking about your evaluation plan, your ideas for change, and the goal that you would like to achieve, you now have a gap in mind that you'd like to close. And you can start by thinking of which of several potential changes will actually lead to the desired improvement, so that you can help people learn about the change prior to going full scale with your implementation. And this really helps us to think on a small scale. Testing gives us some evidence base that a change really does result in improvement that we expected to happen, which is why we make predictions. And if we stray from those predictions and don't have the expected outcome, or have what we call a fabulous failure, we can have that come to light without undermining any performance and the momentum that we've built, and figure out why things fabulously failed and put in fail-safe to prevent that from happening again. We also need to think that there may be multiple changes, multiple iterations, a sequential order of steps that we may need to take, and test multiple things. So testing a change or group of a change gives you information about how much improvement can be expected from that solo change or the set of changes, and to evaluate whether or not we need any additional changes to reach that ultimate goal. And even though a change may have a desired effect in a particular setting, it doesn't mean that it'll necessarily work that exact same way within your situation. So really helping you or your team adapt good ideas to your current and very specific and unique situation prior to rolling things out. We also need to test on a small scale so that if something unintended happens, we don't eat up a lot of costs, be it resources, time, personnel, or equipment, that this new process might have impacted or side effects may have carried over into. And it's also easier for people to agree to test something and have an opportunity to learn if they know that it's on a small scale, short-term basis, just to see if it works, instead of throwing out the old way of doing things. So testing really has people learn about the new way, see if it's actually better, and get some buy-in from them so that they're more willing to embrace the new process. We can then use our PDSA cycles in a singular fashion or a set of them to begin to increase our degree of belief, whether we're starting from the bottom of the barrel or with a high degree of belief that this is the appropriate change. That doesn't matter. But we need to take some things into consideration so that we can bolster our own degree of belief, but then also to provide more evidence, experience, and best practice to others as we start to get them to buy in. We need to then also look at how similar the environment is from those changes that we're learning from to the actual environment that we're applying them to. And as we develop our changes and sets of changes, our belief starts off slow because we have limited knowledge to support our tests and predictions. But as we do more testing and discover what works and doesn't work, as well as better understand the process we're trying to improve, our degree of belief increases. And when our change results in improvement, our degree of belief moves from low to medium. And then as we test under those multiple types of conditions, environments with different people at times of the day, it continues to increase. And this translates into our sequential building of knowledge that was just illustrated on the past slide. So we have successive tests of change that build knowledge and create a ramp to improvement through rapid cycles of change, starting out on a very small scale, following up as needed, doing more wide-scale tests of change before we move to implementation. All of this starting with some evidence, things that were best practice, our own hunches or theories, and those testable, innovative ideas. As we progress through a learning collaborative or a series of learning collaboratives that have had multiple innovations, we move through stages. As we start off, we're in the innovative stage where we're really trying to draft our change package, our tools, and our processes, working to brainstorm, adapt plans for change, and getting the team engaged. This is very similar to how you may be starting off with this particular effort, trying to figure out what works best for your clinical setting and the patients and providers that you work with. You then move to a pilot phase where you're testing some of those ideas. And as you're testing ideas, you're starting to increase your degree of belief that this is appropriate for you and those that you work with and the patients that you care for, retesting and revising as needed, until you get to that green phase, our spread phase, or moving to implement and disseminate a change package, where you have a high level of confidence and degree of belief that this is appropriate for your practice, you've worked out any kinks, and that you're ready to share the adapted change package with others that may not have been active participants in this effort. Now that we have some background on the PDSA cycle, we can walk through the specifics: plan, do, study, and act. In the first part of this plan, we're laying out the objective or what we hope to accomplish through this single PDSA cycle. We also want to lay out the questions we hope to answer and predict what we think will happen, and try and formulate that prediction in the format of a hypothesis of what you think will happen when you try X, so that when you get data, you can compare it back to it and see why it may have worked or why it didn't work. And then lay out the actual steps that you would like to conduct when you move to the next part of do. So noting a very simple, somewhat detailed plan of who's going to do what, where, when, and how. It's also important here to include a data collection plan and have it formatted in a way that will help inform your results when you're analyzing it and making a decision in the final two steps of study and act. As I've done in the past, I like to bring us back to the key driver diagram. And here on the screen, we currently have the Ohio QI2U Men-B key driver diagram, and really orientating us to the key drivers and the interventions on the middle and right-hand columns of this as we work to shape the plan, do, study, act cycles that we will conduct over the course of the coming months that will impact not only our short-term but our long-term outcomes. So with the key drivers in mind, these really big picture items that when we put a series of interventions together, we'll achieve, and then together all those key drivers will help us move towards the SMART aim and eventually the global aim. So here we're looking at taking plan, do, study, act cycles, small incremental bite-sized pieces and tests of change that are focused on improving our office reminder systems and outreach, encouraging teen-centered care, how we can best leverage missed opportunities to make sure that we're getting adolescents up to date on not only their well visit care, but vaccination of the Men-B series. We're raising awareness around the importance of the adolescent well child visit. We're improving you as the provider the ability to discuss MenB vaccines with adolescents and patients, and how your practice and your office can best utilize systems to discuss and administer the MenB vaccine. So with those key drivers in mind, we can then shift to a specific key driver and then look at the interventions that are associated with that. So for example, encouraging teen-centered care. The box to the right of that has several interventions that you can do to help promote teen-centered care by providing age-appropriate materials suited to the needs of the adolescent, all the way down to fostering a trusting relationship and a safe space for the adolescents that you care for. With those interventions in mind, you can adapt these as what we've seen as interventions or best practice to your unique clinical setting, your providers that you work with, and the patients, the adolescents and families that you work with, and adapt to what works best. So that's what you can use for your individual PDSA cycles. Also, as you're planning out your PDSA cycle, it's helpful to note the time component. Try to do it on the smallest scale as possible and within the shortest time frame. Try to think of these as cycles of 1 or cycles of 3, taking baby steps to help inform your learning through multiple iterations of the PDSA cycle. They can't be too small, and they almost always lead to some form of learning, but the purpose is to achieve it rapidly, very quickly, so it can educate your next steps. So when you're thinking about planning for a particular PDSA cycle, instead of looking at doing something over the course of weeks, what can you accomplish over the series of a day or even a clinic afternoon that will help inform your next steps, that will help you achieve your ultimate goal that you've laid out in your evaluation plan? With a clearly defined plan, we can move to the second step, do. This is where we're going to carry out the plan, again, implementing it on a small scale basis so that we can have rapid learning occur. Collect the data that you've laid out in your evaluation plan, again, part of the planning phase, and document any problems or things that were unexpected that you've observed. And this will help when you begin to analyze your data in the study component. The third part, study, is where you're going to really summarize and analyze your data. Use the data and the experience of doing the test to discuss, if you're within a team, what happened. Did you get the results that you expected? If not, why? And did anything unexpected happen during the test? Comparing what you thought would happen from that prediction you phrased at the beginning to the items at the end, and summarizing what you learned overall. The final step of the PDSA cycle is act, and to think about what changes need to be made, if any, to help inform one of 3 steps that you can take. If things didn't go at all how you expected, abandoning the specific test of change. If things happened just about how you thought they should occur, maybe adapting it, making some small modifications, noting those modifications within the plan, and trialing it again. Or everything worked great. It was perfect for you, your clinical setting, the providers and patients that you work with, where you can adopt as is and move forward, where your next steps would then be scaling things up. Now that I've had an opportunity to walk through each of the steps and what comprise the steps of a PDSA cycle, it's time to come back to that office flow diagram that we mentioned and worked on in the previous webinars. By now, you should have made a deployment flowchart or process map for your immunization history and how you review that for your adolescent patients to see whether or not they're up to date and what series may need to be completed, specifically here, HPV or your MenB vaccines. So taking that office flow that you've made, what it currently looks like, and hopefully having thought about some potential change opportunities and ways that you could measure that, we're going to look at the clouds that you've placed on your documents and walk through a potential PDSA that you could then do using your office flow as an initial kickoff point. So here is our PDSA worksheet, and the one that you can use to help facilitate the planning and then the notation of your do, study, and act components of the PDSA. And I'm going to walk you through one of the potential change opportunities and ways that we thought we could measure it based on the information we gleaned from our office flow diagram. So walking through this PDSA worksheet, our long-term goal of this is to really have the system and processes in place to check the vaccination status of every adolescent that walks through your door, and knowing whether or not they're up to date, if a series needs to be completed, and how to get this embedded into your system for a longitudinal period of time. Our focus of this is going to really be our patients, providers, and the system that we're working in to test a change. And the aim of this specific cycle is that at least 50% of tomorrow's adolescent patients will have their chart and Impaxis record reviewed for their immunization status. And here we're looking at HPV and our MenB series and noting whether or not they're up to date or if a vaccine is due when this patient comes in tomorrow. Going back to that key driver diagram, we want to leverage missed opportunities and incentivize participation. So every time someone walks in the door, we want to make sure we have a system in place that we can identify whether or not a vaccine is needed. Some questions that we may have to address or hope to answer is about the time that it will take to do this and if we can do this in a sustainable fashion, and what's the best way to flag a chart for those individuals and adolescents that we've identified as needing a vaccine. Our short, succinct measurement and evaluation plan is that nursing will help us collect this information, and the measure of interest is to calculate the percent of adolescents who had their EMR and Impaxis reviewed, looking for tomorrow, Tuesday, Tuesday's patient load, working on Monday to evaluate the EMR and Impaxis records for immunization status, and then following up the next morning on Tuesday to see what the outcome of that is. We'll do all this at the nursing station, and the method is the number of adolescents with records that were reviewed divided by the number of adolescent visits that were attended on Tuesday. Now, just a simple notation of the individuals that are involved in this process and the steps that they'll work to complete. Our front desk, Susie, will print off the adolescent appointments that were scheduled for Tuesday morning. Our nursing staff will help us review the history and schedule for the patients from that EMR and Impaxis, and also note as part of this process what immunizations actually need to be given if an adolescent isn't up to date. John will be the physician and see the adolescents as they attend their appointments and provide the immunizations that are noted, and then the team will come together and review the data. Our prediction is that if nursing has enough time to review all these records on Monday afternoon and to compare the two sources of immunization history, that at least half of our adolescent patients will have their vaccination status checked and their immunizations provided. And short time frame here. We're starting this and doing some of the work on Monday afternoon, and we'll complete it the next day during the morning. And now I bring us back to the diagram that we had of the cyclical nature of PDSA cycles and our goal that having at least 50% of tomorrow's adolescent patients with their chart and Impaxis record reviewed for their immunization status, looking specifically at the HPV and the MenB series. And our question is, what changes can be made to help us reach this goal? And we've outlined some of those in the planning step. But to take it a next step further is to look at the PDSA cycle as a mini experiment. So on the previous slide and first part of the PDSA worksheet, we've outlined the purpose of our experiment. We have a little research to inform us of how we may best do this. And we've made a prediction or our hypothesis about what we think is going to happen. And then as we progress through the final 3 stages, we're going to do our experiment, conduct it. Our study or analysis will occur after we have those observations and the experiment conducted. And we'll conclude things with our act step, deciding what's next, what changes may be needed, and how we're going to build or cycle this up and make our conclusions. So very similar to what you may have done during your middle school or high school career of
carrying out a mini experiment, we're doing those same simple steps here in a PDSA cycle to identify what's the best way to check vaccination status on a small scale with our adolescent patients. So continuing through the rest of the PDSA cycle and our worksheet, it's now time to actually carry it out, do that experiment. So having done it, was our PDSA carried out as planned? Yes. We had a slower clinic afternoon on Monday and light adolescent visits on Tuesday, so we were able to review everything and have those charts cross-checked between the EMR and Impax's system. We found out that we may need some better system in place for noting what immunizations are specifically needed and where we can note that in the EMR. We did encounter, as we were coming through, while we had a light schedule, we had some same-day appointments scheduled, and we weren't sure the best way to go about checking their vaccination status between those two sources, the EMR and Impaxis, without really interrupting our office flow, because there were other visits that were coming in that were impeding the flow of this. So that's something for us to think about as we work to build this cycle up in the next iteration. Did our results match our predictions? So now we're going to analyze the data and summarize the results during the study phase. No, it didn't. We thought 50% of our patients would have this done, and we were able to get through all those that we knew were on the schedule. We learned that all patient records and Impaxis were checked except for those same-day patients, and that if a well-child visit was attended previously within the past year, our practice was pretty good at making sure that immunizations were up to date. So really it's just making sure those series vaccinations and additional appointments are scheduled and we keep on task with those. The final part of the PDSA cycle is ACT. We're going to list some lessons learned, make conclusions, and figure out how confident we feel to take next steps. We met our aims and goals. We somewhat answered the questions we wanted to address. We'll still work on how we can make this sustainable and what we can do about those clinical flow and patients that we may see scheduled during that same day. But we're going to adopt some of the lessons that we've learned. We're going to continue to check the schedule and verify records the prior day as long as our patient volume and workload allows us to, and we'll figure out a process in case that doesn't happen. We need office flow that's okay and will help us assist with same-day patients at schedule. So how can we check and verify that the immunization status is up to date for those adolescents that schedule that same day, regardless of the visit type? And we need a process for the front desk when they're scheduling patients as they're calling in to get their visits in the schedule for the day or the next day, specifically those with series to be completed, about how we can look at the timing and spacing of those doses so that we're not having families come in for an extra visit that's unnecessary.
As we near the end of this webinar on PDSA cycles, I think it's helpful to point out a few key things. As you're embarking on this journey, try to do your initial cycles on the smallest scale as possible, always thinking in cycles of 1 or 3, taking baby steps to help inform your learning process. Even if things don't go as expected, failures are still a good learning opportunity, and sometimes those can be even better than the successes. So you can learn what didn't work and put fail-safes in to prevent that from happening in the future. And after you've tested over a series of conditions with different people and looked at different times of the week and days and patient populations, you can start to move towards implementation. And as you're doing this, think about different factors that could lead to breakdowns, again, those failures, and putting in the supports that are necessary to prevent that from happening again. And what items can you glean from this that will help get the buy-in of naysayers? And also working to ensure little chance for failure, so getting all the kinks out of the system before this goes wide scale. Some common pitfalls, and some of these were addressed throughout the webinar, is making sure to link your overall objective of the PDSA cycle with those of the key drivers listed in the key driver diagram. If you don't make a prediction before you test a change, it's hard to go back and to see whether or not things work the way you wanted them to or not. So having a clearly defined prediction or hypothesis lends to the learning process. You also want to devote appropriate time to each of the 4 steps of the cycle. Your planning phase should have detail to help carry out the process, but don't spend too much time planning and not enough time actually carrying out the test of change. Similarly, don't spend so much time doing the PDSA cycle that you never get to learn and study from it and take your next steps. Again, learning from your failures. There are a lot of good things to take away from this, and failure is one of those things. So even if things don't go exactly as planned, what are those key factors or the critical factors for success that you can take away that were either necessary or missing from your PDSA cycle, and trialing it with those then in place? While we don't want you spending too much time on the planning component of the PDSA, having a detailed plan will let you know whether or not things went accordingly. And as this aligns with the sustainability factor of evaluation, it's really helpful to lay out your evaluation plan, trying to think ahead a couple cycles from your initial PDSA cycle to what you want to have accomplished in the short term, the medium term, and the long term, laying out that plan of attack for what you want to accomplish over the next couple of weeks. If you're interested in learning a little more about PDSA cycles, when you look at this slide deck, you can click on the Cucumber PDSA link here and hear some more information from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement.
And I'll conclude this webinar in a very similar fashion as the others with an action item. And this one's going to be how you can plan out your first test of change. We have some documents that we've worked on previously, our office flow and what that currently looks like, hopefully in the form of your deployment flow map. You have the key driver diagram and your collaborative and practice aims. With those items in hand, and hopefully with your team together, coming and talking about black box or cloud items that may have been noted on your deployment map, change opportunities that you've identified on your flow map or maybe within the key driver diagram that you aren't doing yet, and how you can potentially measure those. Talk about those items and what you think would be a good platform and initial small-scale test of change that you can do that will help you in your strategic thinking and sequential thinking about taking the inputs and activities that you have within your current system and resources to not only accomplish something in the short term and the intermediate outcome of this learning collaborative, but for sustainability. And having that long term in mind and what would be sustainable for the longitudinal component, think about what your initial step or test of change will be to help move the needle within this collaborative. Build your confidence within your team that this is an appropriate step to take and get the appropriate buy-in by starting small and scaling up those tests of change. So thinking about what your short-term goal will be and how that'll help you reach the collaborative aims. Come together to identify what resources and activities you'll utilize as you conduct this first PDSA plan, aligning everything with your overall evaluation plan, and coming together to trial on a very small scale with a small subset of patients and some providers to determine what's the best way to approach this item that's of interest to your team. And then build on that, build the knowledge, build the evidence base that helps you put the foundation in place to move forward and achieve what you've outlined in your evaluation plan. And we'll be walking through some of these items within KEDA and on some of our calls and on some of your site visits and team meetings that you have with our project team to help you accomplish these things. But this is time for you to get started as a group.